the sense that it's complete in itself, it's unified in itself, but it's thinking about what being truly one would be, which would be not thinking. So in the process of thinking about what being truly one would be, it's creating things, not temporal, like not through time or anything, but it creates things by thinking about what being truly one would be. But it can't do that because it's thinking about it. The very activity that it's doing it by does not allow it to be what it wants to be.
So is metacognition required for intellect?
Well, what do you mean by metacognition?
Thinking about thinking, an awareness of the thinking going on.
Right, so intellect would be thinking, thinking, thinking. So basically, in order for a soul like us, a human who goes through discursive reasoning, to be one with the intellect would be to think about what thinking is. Thinking. And then we have to remove ourselves so we can become thinking. So yeah. Intellect is thinking about itself.
Okay, what's the difference between intellect and will then?
So intellect is thinking about itself by necessity, because if it didn't think about itself, it wouldn't be intellect, because intellect is thinking. So it's not by will, like it can't will itself not to exist, at least according to what he's saying.
Right, I was just saying, can you have will without intellect?
Right, and I don't know. I would say no, but I wouldn't know how to necessarily argue that.
Right.
Well,
I'm just,
musing. I know, and it's good.
I'm musing.
So, I mean, one of the arguments I have against what he's saying is that, so he's saying definition of eternity. Or eternity itself is directed toward the one by intellect, and is in the one, and has being and life. Within eternity, there's also being and there's life. But if eternity is in intellect, because intellect has always been there, and it's also in the one, which doesn't have being or life, it doesn't have any of those things, it's just one. It doesn't make sense to me, because the one's obviously eternal. Otherwise, intellect wouldn't have something to eternally think about. And if the one's eternal and eternity also has being and life in it, then the one has being and life in it. And if it has being and life, then it has, like by necessity, it has sameness, it has otherness, it has
it has change.
Motion, it has substance, it has being, it has rest, it has life. Like it has it's multiplicity now. Like now you just made the one multiple by saying that the one is eternal. And that's just one of the arguments I have against it.
Right. Yeah, the idea of change within. Yeah, because I mean, the idea of eternal is almost removed from the idea of change. Like it's hard to think of those two at the same time. So.
Right.
Yeah, there's a.
And then he said what you said. That which is, like what is eternity. and what is only. But what is has being. There's something there that it is. And if there is an is in the one, then it's now multiple. Like he would say that the one isn't even the one. Like you can't say the one is the one. Then you've made it. The one doesn't think about what the one is because it doesn't need to, because it already has itself.
Basically, because you can't. It's almost the idea that the one can't be observed, therefore the one can't exist, even though it does.
Right.
From our
Yeah.
perspective.
Right. And the other thing is that he's talking about the hardest thing there is to talk about by definition.
Right. Yeah, when you're proposing something that can't be directly, you almost can't directly discuss it. You have to discuss it via analogy and indirectness. It makes it even more difficult to, logic back out of. Almost requires so much creation of meaning as you discuss it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not even easy to communicate.
Like he uses the analogy of the sun a lot. So he's like, it must be a radiation from it while it remains unchanged. Like the bright light of the sun, which, so to speak, runs around it, springing from it continually while the sun remains unchanged.
So that's actually kind of a bad analogy.
Why would you say it's a bad analogy?
Well, I mean, the sun doesn't remain unchanged. Talking about SUN, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So that's
right. So I mean, but he's an ancient guy, so I don't know. He doesn't have like the science or whatever. But yeah,
it's so I mean, that's a separation.
Right. Yeah. And so any analogy would be
seen on an idea, a perception that has since been determined to be flawed.
Right. And he might say that he would also say that the analogy is flawed in some respect because we can't use an analogy to describe the one's relationship with everything else.
Right, but the
one doesn't even have a relationship with everything else.
Right, but the warrants of that analogy is that it's something that is known, and yeah, I don't know. It depends on how they're using the analogy. If they're using the analogy to look at the idea of the unchanging, or to really, or if it's really distant and just kind of narratively analogous.
So we're saying all things which exist, as long as they remain in being, necessarily produce from their own substances. So they produce from what they are, not by their will or anything else. Independence on their present power, a surrounding reality directed to what is outside them, a kind of image of the archetypes from which it was produced. And so he uses the analogy of fire producing the heat which comes from it, and then that snow does not only keep its cold inside itself.
Is he conflating the ideas of movement with creation?
So he's saying that the one, like everything that came from the one, didn't come from the one's movement or change.
Right.
That necessarily the one couldn't have done that, and that things came out of the one by necessity of what the one is. Like what, fire producing heat. So heat comes off of the fire because the fire is fire.
Right. I was trying to figure out how he's differentiating that from, because we were talking about will. I assume that comes into it. It's like willful movement versus change.
Yeah. Does will change who you are?
Because I think that's if you perceive
That's a good
the
point.
soul to be it comes down to the metaphysical versus the physical, and the idea of like fire moves, it changes and produces or whatever, but it's not because of the will of itself. It's just that's a physical change. It's physical movement.
Right.
Versus you have to compare it to human thought, which is in metacognition, which is things change metacognitively because of its own, like it's guiding its own change. It's not inevitable.
So can something which isn't in time have a will?
I would think so. I don't think that would make sense.
So, and then the other question would
Because
be:
I think a will
is
is an
having
agent of change. It's not necessarily change itself.
right? And does having a will like change who that it is? So if a metaphysical entity willed something and like continually wills it, does that change what it is? Does the existence of a will change itself?
Necessitate changement in the being containing the
Yeah.
will.
I wouldn't think so.
I don't really think so.
It's different than our will, because my will can change who I am. I would think if I will to eat a burger, then I'm now a burger eater. Whereas once before, before my will, I was not a burger eater.
Right, but you're going all the way to physical completion of an action.
Yeah, and then
But if you think about will contained entirely
time.
metaphysically.
So I'm doing it within time. So I'm saying within time, my will changes who I am because time goes side by side with the physical world.
Right. But outside of time, does your will change who you are?
Right. Okay.
Physically.
That's a good point.
I mean, because like I mean, whenever I'm thinking about this, I start thinking about I don't know. I always find writing and creating narratives and stories to be a really good analogy framework that I can kind of think of this stuff in. So it's like if you think of an idea or create a character or a thing in your head, it didn't exist previously because you just made it up.
Yeah.
So it was an act of will to create it, but it doesn't necessarily exist outside of yourself. So there's no physical change.
Well, I would say that it existed. I would say that whatever thought we have existed somewhere. We're just accessing it. Like the idea of a unicorn exists, even though the physical unicorn may not. It's not like I created the unicorn, like the idea of a unicorn. I wouldn't think.
Yeah, but when you say, okay, I'm gonna take and I'm gonna create this piece and this piece and this piece, and then I'm gonna weave them all together into this complex, interactive kind of thought and simulation of movement and reality. Does that mean that exists somewhere already? You're saying that all possible combinations of thoughts exist?
certainly that possibility exists. Otherwise, you couldn't have made that complex